In the summer of 1991, a newborn girl vanished from a hospital nursery in the middle of the night, and no one noticed she was gone until the sun had already come up. Police searched every hallway, every stairwell, every parked car in the visitor lot. Nothing. No security footage worth reviewing in an era before cameras covered more than the front entrance. No witnesses remembered anything unusual. No ransom call, no note, no trace of the infant anyone had named Hope before she was even 12 hours old. The case went cold within a year, filed away as one of the rare, unbearable mysteries a small hospital and a small town simply had to learn to live beside. 32 years later, a woman going through her recently deceased mother's belongings would find a folder of paperwork that didn't add up. A discrepancy so small it could have been mistaken for a clerical error if it hadn't unraveled, thread by thread, into one of the most devastating true stories anyone in that town had ever heard. What she uncovered next would shock everyone who ever thought they knew her. Before we continue, if you enjoy mysteries, cold cases, and shocking investigations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another mystery. Now, let's get into today's story. Millbrook Falls sat along a slow bend of the river in western Pennsylvania, a town of just under 12,000 people built around a paper mill that had employed 3 generations of the same families before it finally closed in the late 1990s, leaving behind a downtown of brick storefronts that still bore the faded ghost signs of businesses nobody living could quite remember. The air in summer carried the faint, sweetish smell of the mill even years after it went quiet, a smell longtime residents claimed had simply soaked into the brick itself and would never fully leave, mixing with cut grass and river water into something almost nobody who grew up there could smell anywhere else without feeling a pull of homesickness they couldn't quite explain. Agnes Medical Center was the only hospital within 30 miles. A modest 4-story building with a maternity ward proud enough of its reputation that women from 3 counties over drove in to deliver there, drawn by a nursing staff that prided itself, in the words of the hospital's own newsletter that summer, on treating every family who walked through its doors like their own. It was the kind of place where nurses remembered your name from one pregnancy to the next, where the same handful of obstetricians had delivered half the graduating class of the local high school, where nothing, in living memory, had ever gone seriously wrong. The Callahan family had lived in Millbrook Falls for 4 generations, running a hardware store on Main Street that Renee's grandfather had opened in 1948, a narrow, creaking building with wood floors worn smooth by decades of foot traffic and a bell over the door that every child in town could recognize by sound alone. Renee's father, Walt Callahan, had run that store his entire adult life. A quiet, steady man who kept a stool behind the register for his daughters to do homework on after school, and her mother, Bev, worked part-time as a church secretary and suffered from arthritis so severe by the time Renee turned pregnant that even short drives left her in pain for days afterward, a fact that would matter more than anyone could have predicted once Renee needed someone to drive her to appointments in the final months of her pregnancy. Renee Callahan was 19 years old that July, a soft-spoken girl with a wide, easy laugh who worked the register at her family's hardware store on Main Street and had grown up 2 streets over from the hospital where she would, within a few short years, become the town's most enduring tragedy. She had fallen in love the year before with a boy named Danny Pierce, a construction worker 3 years older than her, who left town for a job in Ohio the month she told him she was pregnant. A departure the whole town would spend years debating, some calling it cowardice, others calling it simple, bad timing, though Danny himself, tracked down decades later, would insist he'd meant to come back the moment he'd saved enough to support a family and had no idea, until it was far too late to matter that his daughter had vanished before he ever got the chance to meet her. Renee had spent that entire pregnancy fielding the particular, exhausting judgment small towns reserve for young unwed mothers, whispered comments in the grocery store checkout line, a Sunday school teacher who quietly stopped inviting her to volunteer, a handful of old friends who grew strangely distant the moment her belly began to show, all of it absorbed quietly, without complaint, because she had already decided long before Hope was born, that she would love this baby enough to make up for whatever the town withheld. Renee's older sister, Diane, 24 that summer and already married with a toddler of her own, had been the one to drive her to every prenatal appointment once their mother's arthritis made the trips too difficult. The one who sat beside her in the delivery room holding her hand through 14 hours of labor, the one who would spend the next 3 decades of her life refusing, in ways that would eventually cost her both a marriage and a career, to let the case of her missing niece go cold. Diane had picked out the name herself, half joking, in the delivery room, watching her exhausted sister hold a red-faced, furious newborn for the first time. Hope. Because after everything that year had put the family through, Diane said, they could all use a little of it. Hope Callahan was born at 11:40 in the evening on a Tuesday in July, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a shock of dark hair that made every nurse on the floor stop by the nursery window just to see it. The delivery room warm and close, the window cracked to let in air thick with the smell of the river and the distant hum of cicadas that never quite stopped that time of year. Renee, exhausted after a long labor, had allowed the nursery staff to take the baby for a few hours of standard newborn checks so she could sleep, the ordinary, unremarkable arrangement new mothers accepted at St. Agnes every single day of the year, a nurse wheeling the bassinet away down a hallway lit by the soft, humming fluorescence that never fully turned off, promising she'd bring Hope back the moment she woke hungry. Renee slept harder than she had in months. The particular, bone-deep exhaustion of a body that had just finished the hardest physical work of its life and woke at 5 the next morning to feed her daughter, her body already anticipating the weight of the baby against her chest before she'd even opened her eyes. She found instead a nurse she didn't recognize standing at her bedside with an apologetic, uncertain expression, the overhead light behind her throwing her face into a shadow Renee would describe, decades later, in more detail than she remembered describing almost anything else in her life, explaining that Hope wasn't in the nursery, that surely she must have already been brought in for a feeding, that someone would go check right away. That someone would go check right away became, within 20 minutes, an entire hospital turned inside out, gowns and scrub caps flooding every hallway. A search that widened from the maternity ward to the entire building to the parking lot to the surrounding blocks within the space of a single terrible hour. Renee standing barefoot in the hallway in her hospital gown, refusing every attempt to set. Her back down, screaming a name into a building that had, 20 minutes earlier, felt like the safest place on earth, and Hope Callahan was nowhere to be found. The Millbrook Falls Police Department, a department of 11 officers who had handled nothing more serious than a string of gas station robberies, found itself facing a case unlike anything in its history. Detective Ray Tolliver, a broad-shouldered, deliberate man 18 years into a career he'd expected to end quietly in a town where nothing much ever happened, arrived at St. Agnes before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, the parking lot already crowded with police cruisers, and the first uncertain gathering of neighbors who'd heard the news over a scanner, and would later describe the scene as the worst thing he'd witnessed in 3 decades of police work, a young mother screaming her daughter's name down a hospital hallway while nurses who had delivered half the town's children stood frozen, unable to explain how an infant could simply cease to exist inside a building they had sworn, every single day of their careers, to keep safe. But investigators would soon discover that wasn't even the strangest part. The nursery's sign-out log, the ordinary clipboard system nurses used to track which infant had been taken where and by whom, a low-tech, easily falsified system that no one at St. Agnes had ever thought to question before that morning, showed Hope Callahan checked out at 2:14 in the morning for what was logged only as routine assessment, initialed by a signature that, upon close inspection, matched no nurse currently on staff at the hospital, nor any nurse who had ever worked there according to personnel records stretching back a decade. It was an initial, a scrawled looping L, attached to no name anyone could match to a badge, a shift schedule, or an employee file. Whoever had taken Hope Callahan from that nursery had understood, with unsettling precision, exactly how the hospital's paperwork worked, exactly which box to check, exactly which door led out through a stairwell that bypassed the main nurse's station entirely. It was not, Detective Tolliver would write in his earliest notes, the work of a stranger acting on impulse. It was the work of someone who had studied that hospital's routines for weeks, possibly longer, before the night they finally acted on them. Tolliver pulled security footage from the hospital's single working camera, mounted above the front entrance more as a deterrent than an actual surveillance tool, and found grainy, near-useless footage of the parking lot at 2 in the morning, headlights sweeping briefly across the frame around 2:20, too far and too dark to make out a plate number or even a reliable make of vehicle, a detail that would torment Tolliver for years afterward. Every time newer, better camera technology made headlines in some other town's solved case, wondering what those 30 seconds of grainy footage might have shown if St. Agnes had simply invested in one more camera, positioned 10 feet to the left. Search parties combed the wooded riverbank behind the hospital for 3 straight days. Volunteers wading through waist, deep brush, calling a name that belonged to a baby too young to answer to it, even if she could hear them. The search made desperate and frantic by a summer storm that rolled through on the second day, rain turning the riverbank to mud, thunder rattling windows across town while Renee sat in a hospital chair refusing to leave, watching lightning flash against a window and praying, she would say later, to a God she wasn't sure was listening, that her daughter was somewhere warm and dry. Roadblocks were set up on every route out of town within the first 6 hours, checking trunks and back seats of cars that had, in most cases, already passed through hours earlier. The FBI was called in by the second day, given the interstate implications of a possible abduction, and agents descended on Millbrook Falls with equipment and expertise the local department had never had reason to acquire, dusting the nursery for prints that turned up nothing but the smudged, overlapping evidence of dozens of staff members who had handled that clipboard and that bassinet over the preceding weeks, an evidence trail so contaminated by ordinary hospital routine that it told investigators almost nothing useful at all. Renee Callahan did not leave that hospital for 4 days, refusing every suggestion that she go home and rest, sitting instead in a chair positioned so she could watch the nursery's door, a vigil the nursing staff would later describe as one of the most heartbreaking things they had ever witnessed in decades of collective service, bringing her meals on trays she barely touched, taking turns simply sitting with her in silence when there was nothing left to say. Diane Callahan organized a search effort that would, within a week, involve half the town, flyers with a hospital photograph of Hope's face taped to every telephone pole and storefront window between Millbrook Falls and the county line, a reward fund that grew dollar by dollar from local church collections and a bake sale the high school held without anyone even needing to ask, into a sum large enough to make national news within the month. Diane herself, standing on a folding table outside the grocery store some Saturdays with a clipboard and a stack of flyers, refusing to let a single shopper walk past without at least glancing at her niece's photograph. There were other names too, in those early frantic weeks, that surfaced and faded the way names always do in a case with no clear suspect and a town desperate for one. A traveling salesman who had checked into the town's only motel the same week was questioned and released within days once. His employer confirmed his delivery route placed him nearly 300 miles away the night of the abduction. A distant cousin of Renee's, estranged from the family for years over an old inheritance dispute involving Walt Callahan's own father, briefly drew suspicion after a neighbor mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car parked near the hospital that week, a lead that evaporated the moment investigators confirmed the cousin had been out of state at a work conference with a hotel receipt and 3 colleagues to vouch for him. Even a young orderly who had only started at St. Agnes 2 weeks earlier found himself under uncomfortable scrutiny simply for being new and unfamiliar to the rest of the staff, cleared within days once his background check turned up nothing beyond an unremarkable work history and an alibi confirmed by his own mother, with whom he still lived. Each of these threads consumed real hours from a small department utterly unprepared for a case of this scale, each of them leading nowhere. Small tragedies of misplaced suspicion stacked on top of the larger tragedy at the center of everything. Detective Tolliver would say, decades later, that the hardest part of those early months wasn't the absence of leads, but the sheer volume of them. Tips arriving faster than his small department could properly chase down, each one requiring careful attention because any one of them, however unlikely, might be the detail that finally cracked the case wide open. None of them were. The case would not break for over 3 decades, and when it finally did, it would break not because of a tip called into a hotline or a stranger caught on camera, but because of an old filing cabinet in a dead woman's study, waiting patiently for a daughter to finally sit down and go through it. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel continue bringing you stories like this. Now let's continue, because what investigators uncovered next was even more disturbing. Detective Tolliver's investigation, in those early weeks, turned first toward the hospital staff itself, an uncomfortable, necessary process that strained relationships inside St. Agnes for years afterward. A nursing assistant named Carol Bishner, whose shift had ended just before midnight the night Hope disappeared, became an early focus after investigators discovered she had been quietly disciplined the previous year for removing supplies from a locked storage closet without authorization. A minor infraction that suddenly looked, under the lens of a missing infant, like evidence of a woman comfortable, bending hospital rules for her own purposes. Bishner was questioned 3 times over the following month, her home searched with her tearful consent, her phone records and bank statements combed for anything that might explain a motive, investigators poring over years of pay stubs and grocery receipts looking for the faintest sign of a financial windfall or a secret second life. Nothing surfaced. Bishner had no history of infertility, no unexplained absences in the months following the disappearance, no financial windfall that might suggest a black market sale, and her alibi for the specific window of the abduction, confirmed by her husband and, more reliably, by a gas station receipt time-stamped at 1:50 that morning, nearly 9 miles from the hospital, held up cleanly enough that she was formally cleared within 6 weeks, though the suspicion and the resentment it caused among colleagues who felt she'd been treated unfairly would follow her for the rest of her career at St. Agnes. Co-workers who had once invited her to birthday lunches suddenly finding reasons not to, a silent verdict she carried for decades without a single person ever apologizing for it outright. Danny Pierce, Hope's biological father, working construction in Ohio and unaware, by his own account, that Renee had even given birth yet, was tracked down by federal agents within a week and questioned at length about whether he might have arranged to take the child himself, a theory that gained brief traction when investigators learned he had told coworkers in a moment of drunken self-pity at bar the week before that Renee's family had never thought he was good enough to raise a child with her, a comment 2 separate coworkers repeated to agents almost word for word. Danny's alibi, a full shift at a construction site logged by a foreman who had no reason to lie for him, and phone records showing no contact whatsoever with anyone in Millbrook Falls in the 2 weeks surrounding the birth, cleared him within days, though he would carry the suspicion and a guilt he never fully articulated even to himself for the rest of his life, eventually attempting, and failing, to reconcile with Renee nearly a decade later, the 2 of them bound forever by a loss neither had actually caused, meeting once at a diner halfway between their 2 towns and finding they had nothing left to say to each other beyond an apology that couldn't undo anything. A third thread, thinner but more unsettling to Detective Tolliver personally, involved a hospital chaplain named Reverend Elias Combs, who had been present in the maternity ward the night of the disappearance to sit with another family whose infant had been born with serious complications earlier that same evening, a baby who, tragically, would not survive the week. Combs had access to nearly every floor of the hospital at all hours, a familiar, trusted presence nurses rarely thought to question, and his movements that night, when reconstructed, showed a gap of nearly 40 minutes unaccounted for by anyone's memory. Combs, when questioned, explained that he had been sitting alone in the hospital chapel during that window, praying, a claim impossible to verify and uncomfortable to challenge given the circumstances, and though nothing ever tied him concretely to Hope's disappearance, the coincidence of his unaccounted time, layered against the raw tragedy of the family he'd been comforting that same night, would nag at Tolliver for the rest of his career, a loose thread he could never quite bring himself to stop tugging even after Combs passed a polygraph and was never charged with anything at all. A fourth name entered the file almost by accident, nearly 2 months in, a traveling medical equipment salesman named Gary Prine, who had been seen in the hospital's supply hallway twice that week, delivering new bassinet monitors, a stranger to most of the staff, and therefore, in the anxious months following the disappearance, someone investigators felt obligated to fully rule out rather than dismiss, on instinct alone. Prine's employer confirmed his delivery schedule down to signed receipts at every stop, placing him nearly 200 miles away the night of the abduction, a clean, boring alibi that closed the thread within a week, but that Tolliver logged anyway, understanding by then that a case this strange demanded exhausting every possibility, however unlikely, rather than trusting gut instinct alone. Every lead, in those first frantic months, seemed to circle back to the same impossible conclusion. Whoever took Hope Callahan had walked into St. Agnes Medical Center that night, understood its routines well enough to forge a plausible sign-out, and walked back out again without a single person noticing anything wrong until it was already far too late. A level of calm, practiced deception that made Detective Tolliver's skin crawl every time he thought about it for the rest of his career, because it suggested, more than any stranger snatching, a baby from a stroller ever could, a mind that had planned this abduction with patience, precision, and an unsettling, specific kind of care. The case sat cold for the better part of 3 decades, the way cases do, not through any single failure, but through the slow accumulation of exhausted leads and a public attention span that could not sustain itself indefinitely against the total absence of new information. Detective Tolliver retired in 2004, still haunted, by his own admission, by that scrawled, unidentified L on the nursery clipboard, a detail he would bring up unprompted at his own retirement dinner, telling colleagues he'd solved every case of his career except the one that mattered most, and that he hoped whoever inherited the file would keep chasing it even after everyone else had stopped asking. Renee Callahan never fully recovered, marrying briefly in her late 20s to a man who would later say he'd never once felt like he came first in her life. Not because she didn't love him, but because some part of her never stopped waiting for a phone call that never came. A marriage that ended quietly after 6 years with no children of their own, a choice Renee made deliberately, she told her sister once, because she didn't trust herself not to spend every day of a second daughter's life terrified of losing her too. She kept working the register at the family hardware store long after her father passed it down to a nephew, telling customers who asked after her that she was doing just fine. A small, practiced lie she'd perfected over decades of being asked a question she never knew how to answer honestly. Diane Callahan kept the case alive almost single-handedly through the years that followed, maintaining a scrapbook of every newspaper clipping, every flyer, every dead end, updating it faithfully every time a new missing persons database came online or a new forensic technique made headlines elsewhere in the country, driving 3 hours twice a year to the state crime lab just to ask, in person, whether anything new had come in, a ritual that cost her a promotion she'd been in line for at the accounting firm where she worked. Her supervisor eventually telling her, not unkindly, that her heart clearly wasn't fully in the job anymore, and that maybe it was time to consider what she actually wanted out of the rest of her career. Diane took early retirement in 2015 and spent the years that followed volunteering with a national missing children's organization, helping other families navigate exactly the bureaucratic maze she'd spent 2 decades learning to survive, telling anyone who asked that she'd rather spend her remaining years helping someone else's family find an answer than spend 1 more year waiting quietly for her own. She created, in 2016, a public profile on a genealogy platform that had just begun growing in popularity nationwide, uploading her own DNA in the hope, however distant, that some overlooked cousin or half-sibling of Hope's might one day take a similar test out of nothing more than idle curiosity, pinning a single sentence to the top of her family tree that she would refresh and rewrite slightly every few years, never once imagining, across all that time, exactly who might eventually read it. Then, in the autumn of 2023, a woman named Grace Whitfield, 42 years old and living 3 states away in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, sat at her mother's kitchen table sorting through boxes of paperwork 6 weeks after burying the only parent she had ever known. Louise Whitfield had died of a sudden stroke at 71, leaving behind a modest house, a garden she'd tended obsessively for 40 years, roses she pruned with the same fierce, protective care she'd shown Grace her entire life, and a filing cabinet full of the ordinary bureaucratic debris of an unremarkable life, insurance policies, tax returns, a marriage certificate from her second husband Walter, who had passed away himself a decade earlier. The house still smelled faintly of her mother's perfume weeks after the funeral. a detail Grace found unbearable and comforting in equal measure every time she opened a closet door, and she found herself moving through the rooms slowly, deliberately, putting off the filing cabinet in the study for nearly a month before finally forcing herself to sit down with it on a gray, rainy Saturday afternoon. Grace had always known she was adopted, a fact Louise had told her gently when she was 7 years old and never made into a secret, though Louise had always been strangely, consistently vague about the specifics, telling Grace only that the adoption had been arranged privately, through a family friend rather than an agency, before Grace was even a year old, and that the paperwork, unfortunately, had been lost in a move sometime in the mid-90s, an explanation Grace had accepted without question for nearly 4 decades, the way children accept almost anything their parents tell them about their own beginnings, because questioning it had simply never felt necessary when the love itself had never once felt uncertain. Grace had never pushed the subject as a child, content with a mother who loved her fiercely and unreservedly, but sitting at that kitchen table with a folder marked simply G in her mother's careful handwriting, she found something that made her stomach turn in a way she couldn't immediately explain. Inside was a single sheet of adoption paperwork, notarized in 1992, listing Grace's date of birth as the previous December, a date that matched the birthday Grace had celebrated every year of her life. But tucked behind it, nearly stuck to the back of the folder from decades of storage, was a second document, an older one, water-stained and partially illegible, a form that appeared to be a hospital discharge summary from a facility in Pennsylvania Grace had never heard of, dated a full 7 months before the birthday she had always known as her own. But that wasn't the only inconsistency Grace found that afternoon. The discharge summary listed no patient name, the relevant field torn away entirely, but it listed a birth weight, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and a note in a doctor's cramped handwriting describing a healthy newborn female with a notable shock of dark hair. Grace sat with that piece of paper for nearly an hour before she let herself consider what it might mean, running through every innocent explanation she could think of. A mixed-up form from an entirely unrelated adoption case Louise might have kept by mistake, an old medical record from before Grace was even born that had simply gotten shuffled into the wrong folder over decades of moves. But something about the date gnawed at her in a way she couldn't quite dismiss. A full 7 months earlier than her own recorded birthday, which would mean, if the document actually belonged to her, that she was not 42 years old at all, but closer to 43, and that the birthday she had celebrated every single year of her life, complete with a specific age Louise had always insisted on, had never actually been hers to begin with. Grace mentioned the discrepancy to her husband that evening, half expecting him to talk her out of the unsettled feeling that had followed her around all day, watching his face carefully across the dinner table for some sign that she was overreacting to a simple filing mistake. Instead, she found herself, almost on impulse, ordering an at-home DNA testing kit online that night, telling herself it was simply curiosity about her ancestry, the kind of harmless hobby half her book club had already taken up, rather than anything more serious, a small white lie she told herself so convincingly she nearly believed it. She mailed the sample back within the week and tried, mostly successfully, to put the entire strange afternoon out of her mind, throwing herself into cleaning out the rest of the house, donating Louise's clothes to a church thrift store, finally selling the car that had sat in the driveway untouched since the funeral, the ordinary, exhausting business of dismantling a life. 6 weeks later, the results arrived with a notification that made her hands go cold before she'd even opened the app, standing in her kitchen with a mug of coffee going lukewarm in her hand. Beneath the expected breakdown of ancestry percentages sat a single flagged match, unusually strong, the kind reserved for a close biological relative, a woman named Diane Callahan, listed as a probable aunt, with a shared family tree that traced back to a small town in western Pennsylvania Grace had never once visited or heard mentioned in her entire life. Grace stared at that name for nearly 20 minutes before she trusted herself to click on it, her pulse loud enough in her own ears that she could hear it over the hum of the refrigerator in her kitchen, the rain that had started that morning now tapping steadily against the window above the sink. Diane Callahan's public profile on the genealogy platform included a single sentence pinned to the top of her family tree, a sentence that had apparently sat there, unanswered, for years, updated and rewritten slightly every few seasons but never once removed, waiting for exactly this moment. Searching for my niece, Hope Callahan, missing since July 1991, born at Agnes Medical Center, Millbrook Falls, Pennsylvania. If this reaches anyone with information, please contact me. Every answer Grace had ever been given about her own life suddenly seemed to belong to someone else entirely. She did not sleep that night, sitting instead at her own kitchen table with her laptop open long after her husband had gone up to bed. The house silent except for the refrigerator's hum and the occasional creak of settling wood, searching every combination of Hope Callahan, Millbrook Falls, and 1,991 inches she could think of, her coffee long forgotten, until an archived local newspaper article loaded. On her screen, showing a photograph of a young, exhausted, devastated woman named Renee Callahan standing outside a hospital, and beside her, a slightly older woman with the same dark, wavy hair and the same wide-set eyes Grace saw every morning in her own bathroom mirror, identified in the caption as Diane Callahan, the missing infant's aunt. Grace enlarged the photograph on her screen until it pixelated, studying the shape of Renee's face, the particular way she held her own hands, small, unconscious details Grace recognized without being able to say from where, a feeling less like discovery and more like remembering something she had never actually known. Grace reached out to a genetic genealogist rather than to Diane directly, unwilling to detonate a stranger's life, and possibly her own, without understanding first exactly what she might be walking into. The genealogist, a careful, methodical woman named Priya Malhotra, who specialized in exactly this kind of decades-old identity mystery, confirmed within days what the flagged match had already strongly suggested. Grace Whitfield's DNA carried a statistically overwhelming probability of being the biological child of Renee Callahan and a near certainty of being the same infant who had vanished from St. Agnes Medical Center's nursery on a July night in 1991, 32 years and 3 months before Grace sat frozen at her own kitchen table, finally understanding why her mother had always been so strangely, carefully vague about the first year of her life. Priya walked her through the math patiently over the phone, explaining centimorgans and shared segments in terms a layperson could follow, though Grace would later say she absorbed almost none of the technical explanation in the moment, hearing only the plain, devastating conclusion underneath it. Someone had lied to her for 42 years, and the person who had lied to her the longest and the most completely was the only mother Grace had ever known, a woman she had just finished burying, who could no longer answer a single one of the questions now clawing their way up out of Grace's chest, a cruelty of timing that Grace would describe, months later, as its own separate grief entirely, mourning a mother while simultaneously losing the ability to ever confront her. Priya Malhotra reached out to Detective Ray Tolliver's former department on Grace's behalf, and within days, a young detective named Marcus Iyer, who had grown up in Millbrook Falls, hearing about the Callahan case the way children in small towns absorb local ghost stories without ever fully understanding they were true, reopened a file that had sat dormant in an evidence room for over 2 decades. Boxes of yellowed reports and photographs he had to blow dust off before he could even begin reading them. Iyer drove out to meet Grace himself rather than handle the reunion over the phone, understanding, from Tolliver's old case notes, exactly how much devastation this conversation was about to unleash on at least 2 families who had spent 32 years grieving in entirely different directions, sitting with Grace at her own kitchen table for nearly 3 hours on his first visit, letting her ask every question twice, 3 times, however many times she needed before the shape of it finally settled into something she could hold. Grace agreed to a full DNA confirmation through official law enforcement channels, a cheek swab collected in her own kitchen by a technician who drove 3 hours to spare her the ordeal of a public clinic visit, and the result, delivered 11 days later, confirmed everything Priya Malhotra's private analysis had already suggested with devastating, unambiguous clarity. Grace Whitfield was Hope Callahan, the infant who had vanished from a hospital nursery 32 years earlier, whose face had once been taped to every telephone pole in a town 400 miles from the quiet Ohio suburb where she'd spent her entire adult life believing a different story about her own beginning. Iyer called her himself the evening the results came back rather than let her read them alone in an email, and Grace would later say she remembered almost nothing else about that entire week except the particular, gentle steadiness of his voice on the phone, saying her name, her real name, Hope, for the very first time. But if Grace was Hope, the question that had haunted Detective Tolliver for 18 years of active investigation and Marcus Iyer for the 6 months that followed suddenly had a name attached to it that made everyone's blood run cold. Who was Louise Whitfield, and how exactly had she managed to walk out of Agnes Medical Center with someone else's newborn daughter without a single person ever catching her? Marcus Iyer began methodically reconstructing Louise Whitfield's life, starting with the earliest verifiable records he could find, working through property deeds and old employment applications with the same patient, unglamorous persistence Tolliver had once brought to the original case, and discovered almost immediately that the woman Grace had known her entire life as Louise Whitfield had not, in fact, always gone by that name. Property records, employment histories, and an old marriage license led Iyer back through 2 prior surnames. First, Louise Voss, from a marriage that had ended in 1993, and before that, Louise Farrow, the name she had been born under in a town less than 40 miles from Millbrook Falls, a detail that made the hair on the back of Iyer's neck stand up the moment he found it, sitting alone in his office, long after his shift had ended, because it meant the woman who raised Grace had not been some distant stranger passing through Pennsylvania by chance. She had lived less than an hour from the hospital where Hope Callahan disappeared. That wasn't the only lie hiding in Louise Farrow's history. Hospital records from a different facility, a smaller regional clinic 30 miles from St. Agnes, showed that Louise Farrow had given birth to a daughter of her own in April of 1991, 3 months before Hope Callahan's disappearance. A baby girl named Hope Farrow, the same name. Iyer would note with a chill that Renee Callahan had chosen for her own daughter 3 months later, a coincidence that would eventually reveal itself to be no coincidence at all. Baby Hope Farrow had been born with a severe congenital heart defect and had died in the hospital's neonatal intensive care unit at 11 days old, a loss that had, according to a handful of sympathy cards recovered decades later from a storage unit Louise had kept under her maiden name, devastated her so completely that friends and family described her, in the months that followed, as barely recognizable. A woman who had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped answering her own phone, disappearing for days at a time into a grief no one around her seemed equipped to help her carry. A cousin, tracked down by Iyer in a nursing home 2 states away, remembered Louise sitting in her own darkened living room for hours at a stretch that spring, holding a single unworn infant onesie, refusing to let anyone throw it away, refusing, too, to discuss the baby's name with anyone who tried gently to bring it up. They had been looking at the wrong kind of monster this entire time. There had been no trafficking ring, no black market buyer, no stranger with predatory intent lurking in a hospital hallway. There had been a woman shattered by a loss so total it had reshaped the entire architecture of her mind, and a hospital routine ordinary enough in 1991 to let a grieving, desperate, and disturbingly resourceful woman walk out with someone else's daughter and build, over the following decades, an entire second life around the lie that she had never lost a child at all. Marcus Iyer traced Louise's movements in the weeks before the abduction and found a pattern that made the original mystery of the forged nursery sign-out finally make terrible sense. Louise had continued visiting St. Agnes Medical Center regularly in the weeks after her own daughter's death, ostensibly as a volunteer with the hospital's bereavement support program, a role that gave her legitimate, unquestioned access to maternity ward hallways, staff break rooms, and, crucially, the specific paperwork systems nurses used to track newborns overnight. Staff members who remembered her from that period, tracked down decades later and shown an old photograph, described a quiet, grieving woman everyone had felt enormous sympathy for, someone the nursing staff had gone out of their way to be gentle with, bringing her coffee, checking on her between rounds, never once suspecting that the same grief drawing out their compassion was, in fact, the exact mechanism that would let her study their routines closely enough to forge a plausible sign-out weeks later, learning the shift schedules, the exact minute the overnight nurse typically stepped away for her own break, the precise stairwell that led to a rarely used side exit near the hospital's loading dock. Louise had died in Ohio at 71, having never once been questioned by any investigator in 32 years. Having built, evidence would later show, an entirely new identity within 18 months of the abduction, moving 3 states away, changing her surname twice through marriages that Iyer suspected, though could never fully confirm, may have been arranged in part to make her paper trail harder to follow. And raising a daughter she genuinely, unmistakably loved, according to every person who had ever known them both. With the same fierce devotion any mother might show a child she had carried and delivered herself, driving Grace to piano lessons twice a week for a decade, sitting up with her through chickenpox and a broken arm, and every ordinary childhood crisis with the same bone-deep tenderness Renee Callahan had once shown, briefly, to the daughter Louise had taken from her. The forged adoption paperwork found in Louise's filing cabinet, the notarized document Grace had first discovered, turned out to connect to an even larger and more disturbing thread once investigators traced the notary's signature. The document had been stamped and signed by a man named Harold Voss, a small-town notary and part-time attorney who had died in 2001, and whose name, once cross-referenced against a national database of contested adoption cases quietly compiled by federal investigators over the following months, surfaced in at least 2 other cases involving women who had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, with infants, and murky, informally arranged adoption paperwork in the years spanning 1989 through 1996. Voss, it appeared, had run a quiet, off-the-books practice for over a decade, helping desperate women, some grieving, some fleeing abusive situations of their own, manufacture legal-seeming paper trails for children whose origins would not have survived any real scrutiny, a parallel network of forged identities that had operated in the shadows of at least 3 states for years before Voss's own death, finally closed it down for good. Federal investigators, working from Voss's surviving business records, a locked filing cabinet of his own recovered from a storage unit his estate had nearly auctioned off, unopened, identified 2 other women who had passed through his informal practice around the same period, one of whom, tracked down, still living quietly in West Virginia, admitted through tears that she had once, decades earlier, taken in an infant she strongly suspected had not been surrendered voluntarily, choosing, in her own words, not to ask the questions whose answers she was afraid she couldn't live with. That woman, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Barbara Sanford, had taken in an infant in 1994 under circumstances she'd spent 30 years trying not to examine too closely, and she sat for her own DNA confirmation with a kind of resigned, tearful bravery that federal investigators would later say impressed them more than almost anything else in the entire sprawling case. The results confirmed that the daughter she had raised, a woman named Carly, who worked as a veterinarian 2 states away and had no idea, until federal agents contacted her directly, that any of this was unfolding, was in fact the biological daughter of a young mother named Teresa Ostrander, who had reported her infant missing from a laundromat parking lot in 1994 under circumstances local police at the time had, embarrassingly, initially blamed on Teresa's own carelessness rather than treating as a genuine abduction. Teresa, tracked down, still living in the same small Ohio town 3 decades later, had spent 30 years believing, based entirely on the original police department's dismissive handling of her case, that she alone was responsible for her daughter's disappearance, a guilt Carly's reappearance finally, mercifully, lifted from her shoulders after 3 decades of carrying blame that had never actually belonged to her. Carly and Teresa's reunion, occurring almost exactly 4 months after Grace and Renee's, would later be described by Marcus Iyer as the single detail that convinced him this case was never going to be simply about one family, that Louise Whitfield's decision in 1991 had been, however singular it felt to Grace and Renee individually, part of a wider, sadder pattern of grief finding exactly the wrong, outlet through exactly the wrong man's willingness to help. Barbara Sanford, unlike Louise Whitfield, lived long enough to answer for what she'd done, cooperating fully with investigators and testifying in a small, quiet courtroom appearance that drew almost no press attention compared to Grace's own more widely covered story, that she had suspected from the very beginning that the infant she'd been given had not been surrendered willingly, that Voss had told her only that the birth mother was, in his words, not in a position to raise a child properly. Language vague enough to let Barbara convince herself she wasn't doing anything unforgivable. She received a suspended sentence given her age, her health, and her full cooperation, and spent what time she had left, by her own account, trying to build whatever fragile relationship Carly was willing to allow her, an outcome far less resolved and far more painful than Grace's own reunion, a reminder that not every version of this story ended with the same measure of grace extended to the person who had done the taking. Federal prosecutors also pursued charges against Charlene Ruiz, Harold Voss's longtime paralegal, who had continued quietly facilitating similar arrangements for nearly a decade after Voss's own death, using templates and forged notary stamps she'd learned from him directly, though by the time investigators found her she was 78 and in declining health, and the case against her ultimately resolved in a plea agreement that spared her a trial but required her, for the first time in her life, to fully account on the record for every family she had ever helped construct out of someone else's tragedy. Because Louise Whitfield had died before any of this came to light, there was no one left to prosecute for the abduction itself, a fact that left Renee Callahan, in her own words to a reporter, with a strange, unsatisfying kind of closure, grateful beyond measure to have her daughter back, but robbed of any chance to ever confront the person responsible, to ever ask her, face to face, how she had justified 32 years of silence to herself every single day she lived it. The investigation, in the months that followed Grace's DNA confirmation, widened to touch people who had never expected to be pulled into a case they had believed long buried. Reverend Elias Combs, the hospital chaplain whose unaccounted 40 minutes had haunted Detective Tolliver for the better part of 2 decades, was finally formally cleared once Louise's own timeline made unmistakably clear that the chapel and the nursery were nowhere near each other, and that Combs's account of quiet, private prayer during a devastating night on the ward had, in fact, been exactly as innocent as he'd always claimed, a detail that Tolliver, now 81 and living in an assisted care facility, wept over quietly when Marcus Iyer drove out personally to tell him, relieved beyond words to finally set down a suspicion he'd carried, guiltily, for over 20 years, a suspicion he'd never voiced aloud to Combs directly, but that had shaded every polite nod they'd exchanged at town. Events for decades afterward. Carol Bishner, the nursing assistant once disciplined for the unrelated supply closet infraction that had made her an early suspect, was tracked down as well, now retired and living 2 towns over, and wept on her own porch when Iyer explained the truth after decades of quietly wondering whether her own colleagues still harbored private doubts about her despite her official clearance, telling him that she'd spent 30 years feeling the weight of a suspicion she'd never fully shaken loose from certain coworkers' eyes, a burden she could finally, at last, set down entirely, calling her daughter that same evening simply to say she finally felt like herself again for the first time in decades. Danny Pierce, Hope's biological father, now 64, and living alone in Ohio, just 2 hours from the daughter he had never known existed, practically in his own backyard, learned the truth in a phone call from Marcus Iyer that left him unable to speak for nearly a full minute, the coincidence of the distance between them striking him as almost unbearably cruel, a daughter he'd spent 3 decades, believing dead or lost forever, having lived close enough, for years, that he might have passed her at a grocery store without either of them ever knowing, might have stood behind her in a checkout line at some point in the decades since, entirely unaware. Danny drove to meet Grace 6 weeks after Renee did, waiting until the initial wave of media attention around the reunion had died down, telling Iyer he didn't want his own first meeting with his daughter to happen in front of a documentary crew the way the reunion with Renee had. They met instead at a quiet diner exactly halfway between their 2 towns. The same kind of diner, Danny realized only after sitting down, where he and Renee had once had their own last conversation before he left for Ohio 42 years earlier, a coincidence neither of them mentioned aloud until months later. He brought with him a small, battered cardboard box he'd kept in his garage for over 3 decades, containing a single ultrasound photo Renee had mailed him before their relationship fully collapsed, a photo he'd never been able to make himself throw away, even during the years he'd convinced himself their daughter must be dead, unable to explain to himself why he kept a photograph of a child he believed he'd never meet. He slid it across the table to Grace without a word, and Grace, holding it for the first time, said only that she recognized, in the grainy black and white outline, something of her own son's ultrasound photo from years earlier, a strange, unexpected thread of continuity across a family that had been broken apart before it ever had the chance to properly exist. Danny wept for most of that first meeting, apologizing over and over for leaving Renee before Grace was born, for not fighting harder to stay, though Grace found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, spending most of that lunch reassuring him rather than being angry, telling him that whatever mistakes he'd made at 22, none of them were the reason she'd grown up 400 miles away under. A stolen name that the actual thief in this story had never once been him. The two of them built, over the following year, a careful, tentative relationship neither pushed faster than it wanted to grow. Weekend visits every month or two, Danny meeting Grace's husband and her two teenage children for the first time at a cautious, slightly awkward Thanksgiving dinner that ended, by everyone's account, far warmer than any of them had expected, Danny teaching his newly discovered grandson to fish off the same dock behind his house where he'd once, decades earlier, spent long summer evenings imagining a family he assumed he'd never get to have. The massive revelation reshaped everything Millbrook Falls, and Grace herself had believed for over 3 decades. There had been no criminal mastermind, no organized abduction ring, no stranger's cold calculation. There had been an ordinary hospital's ordinary compassion, extended to a grieving woman whose devastation had curdled, in the depths of an unthinkable loss, into a decision that stole one family's entire future to rebuild the ruins of her own, and a second family built on that theft who had, by every honest account, loved each other completely for 42 years regardless of the lie underneath it. But someone was still connected to this story who hadn't yet had the chance to speak, and the reckoning wasn't finished unfolding. Renee Callahan, 61 years old and still living in Millbrook Falls in the same house she'd grown up in, learned that her daughter was alive on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A phone call from Marcus Iyer that she would later say she'd rehearsed receiving in her imagination so many times over 3 decades that the actual moment felt, disorientingly, like living inside a memory rather than experiencing. Something new, the kitchen around her suddenly feeling too bright, too loud, the ordinary hum of the refrigerator suddenly unbearable. She sat on her kitchen floor for nearly 20 minutes after hanging up, unable to stand, unable to call her sister, simply repeating her daughter's name out loud to an empty room until the shape of the word finally felt real in her mouth again after 32 years of holding it like a wound rather than a person. When she finally did call Diane, she could barely get a full sentence out before her sister, hearing something in her voice that she'd never heard before, simply said, "Is it her? Is it finally her?" already crying before Renee could even confirm it. Diane Callahan, the aunt who had never once stopped searching, who had sacrificed a career and very nearly a marriage to a search that had outlasted every reasonable hope anyone else had quietly let go of years earlier, received the news from Priya Malhotra directly, the genealogist she had unknowingly reached out to through nothing more than a decades-old profile on a genealogy website she'd nearly given up checking altogether, having logged into it perhaps twice in the previous 3 years. Diane wept on the phone for so long that Priya, still on the line 400 miles away, simply stayed quiet and let her, understanding that some grief needs nothing more than a witness rather than words. Diane would later say that the strangest part of that entire day wasn't the news itself, but the sensation, sitting afterward at her own kitchen table, of not knowing what to do with her hands that had spent 32 years holding flyers, holding scrapbooks, holding a phone, waiting for a call that had, impossibly, finally come, and now had nothing left to hold at all except the beginning of an answer. Grace herself agreed, after nearly 2 months of intensive work with a trauma-informed therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of identity disruption, sessions that often left her exhausted in a way she'd never experienced before, to travel to Millbrook Falls for a reunion that a small documentary crew was permitted to film with the full consent of everyone involved. Her therapist had warned her, gently, that there was no correct way to feel walking into that reunion, that grief and joy and anger were all allowed to arrive at once, and that she shouldn't feel obligated to perform any particular version of gratitude for cameras or family members alike. She stood outside the same hardware store where her biological mother had once worked the register as a 19-year-old girl, now run by Renee's nephew, for nearly 10 minutes before she could make herself walk the final block to the house where Renee waited. The late afternoon light slanting gold across Main Street's brick storefronts, the same faint mill smell she would later say she couldn't place. Until Diane explained it to her, a smell that seemed to belong, somehow, to a childhood she had never actually lived, but that her body recognized anyway. When the door finally opened, neither woman spoke for what felt, to everyone watching, like an impossibly long moment, two faces built from the same bones finally standing close enough to recognize each other after 42 years apart. Renee's hand rising slowly to her own mouth, Grace standing frozen on the porch step, both of them, according to the documentary crew who captured it, breathing in. Short, shallow bursts, as though neither quite trusted the moment to be real. Diane, standing just behind Renee in the doorway, was the first to move, closing the distance in 2 quick steps and pulling Grace into an embrace so sudden and fierce that Grace would later say it was the first moment the entire reunion felt real to her. Not an idea or a DNA report, but an actual body, an actual person who had spent 32 years refusing to give up on her. Renee followed a moment later, and the 3 women stood together on that porch for nearly a full minute. Nobody speaking, nobody quite ready to be the one who broke the silence first. Grace chose, in the months that followed, to keep the name Grace, unwilling to surrender the only identity she had ever consciously lived inside, though she began slowly, carefully, learning to answer to Hope as well when Renee or Diane used it, understanding it not as a replacement for who she'd become, but as a thread connecting her, finally, to who she had always, technically, been. She grieved Louise Whitfield and hated her in the same breath for months, a contradiction her therapist assured her was not only normal, but perhaps the most honest possible response to loving someone whose love for you had been built from its very first moment on an act of devastating theft. Some days the grief arrived first, missing the specific sound of her mother's laugh, the particular way she hummed while gardening, the small rituals of a 42-year relationship that didn't simply dissolve because its foundation turned out to be a lie. Other days, the anger arrived first instead, a rage Grace hadn't fully expected, directed at a woman who could no longer answer for herself, imagining Renee Callahan's 32 years of grief every time she looked at old photographs of her own childhood birthdays, understanding that every candle she'd blown out, every ordinary happy memory had come at the direct cost of another woman's unbearable loss. She came, eventually, to a fragile, complicated peace with both truths existing at once, telling a reporter who interviewed her the following year that she had decided to stop trying to choose between grieving her mother and grieving the childhood that theft had stolen from an entirely different family, understanding finally that both griefs were allowed to be true at the same time without canceling each other out. She began, with her therapist's encouragement, keeping a journal of her own, something she'd never done before, working through entries some weeks addressed to Louise and other weeks addressed to Renee, occasionally addressed to nobody at all, simply trying to put language to a kind of loss she didn't think anyone else had ever quite experienced in the same configuration she had. She found, to her surprise, an entire small online community of people who had lived through similarly discovered identity swaps, adoptees who had learned through DNA testing that the story of their own birth had been fabricated, and she began corresponding with several of them regularly, finding a strange, specific comfort in language none of her oldest friends could quite offer her, however lovingly they tried. Grace's 2 teenage children, who had grown up believing their grandmother was simply Grandma Louise, the woman who sent birthday cards with too much cash tucked inside and taught them to garden every summer, struggled in their own quieter ways to reconcile the woman they'd loved with the story now attached to her, her older daughter telling a school counselor in a session Grace only learned about months later that she felt guilty for still missing someone who had done something so clearly, unambiguously wrong. Grace worked hard in the years that followed to give her children room to hold their own complicated feelings about a grandmother they genuinely loved, refusing to insist on any single, tidy version of how anyone in the family was supposed to feel about a woman capable of both devastating theft and decades of real, unmistakable devotion. In the 2 years that followed, Grace found herself drawn, almost against her own expectation, toward work connected to exactly the kind of upheaval she'd lived through, volunteering first with a genetic genealogy nonprofit that helped other families navigate DNA surprises of their own, and eventually enrolling part-time in a certification program to become a genetic counselor herself, telling her husband one evening that she couldn't explain it fully except to say that she finally understood, in a way she never had before, how badly people needed someone who could sit with them through news that reorganized their entire sense of who they were. She kept in careful, growing contact with both families, now claiming a piece of her, splitting holidays with a deliberateness that exhausted her some years and steadied her in others, learning slowly which traditions from each side of her life she wanted to keep and which she was allowed to simply let go of without guilt. Her son, in a small gesture that made Grace cry harder than almost anything else in that entire strange, upended year, asked if he could add Hope as a middle name option should he ever have a daughter of his own, a quiet, private way of keeping his grandmother's original name alive somewhere in the family without requiring his own mother to fully choose between the two identities she now carried. Renee, for her part, began slowly rebuilding the parts of her own life she'd frozen in place for 3 decades, finally selling the family hardware store to her nephew outright, rather than continuing to work the register herself several days a week. A decision she said she'd been unable to make for years because some irrational part of her had needed to stay reachable, needed to stay in the same building, the same routine in case her daughter ever tried to find her. She took her first vacation in over a decade the following spring, a short trip to visit Grace in Ohio that stretched, at Grace's insistence, into nearly 2 weeks, the two of them slowly learning each other's small daily habits, the way Grace took her coffee, the specific show Renee liked to fall asleep to some nights, ordinary domestic details that most mothers and daughters absorb across a lifetime, and that the two of them were now gathering, deliberately, one visit at a time. News of the case's resolution reached Millbrook Falls on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in early 2024, over 3 decades after Hope Callahan had vanished from a hospital nursery 4 blocks from the house where her mother still lived. The hardware store, run now by Renee's nephew, but still bearing the same worn wood floors Renee had grown up sweeping as a girl, filled that afternoon with neighbors who had heard the news secondhand and simply wanted somewhere to stand together with people who understood exactly what those 3 decades had cost the town, some of them crying openly at the paint counter, others simply standing quietly. Near the register, hands on each other's shoulders, the particular grief and relief of an entire community finally allowed to exhale. Detective Ray Tolliver, 81 years old and living in an assisted care facility 2 counties away, was called personally by Marcus Iyer, who felt the retired detective deserved to hear the ending of a case that had shaped the rest of his career from someone who understood exactly what those 32 years had cost him. Tolliver reportedly sat in silence on the phone for nearly a full minute before finally asking, in a voice thick with disbelief, whether the little girl with the dark hair everyone remembered from the nursery photographs had grown up happy, whatever else had happened to bring her there, a question Iyer answered honestly, telling him yes, that she had grown up loved, deeply and completely, even inside. A story none of them could have imagined. The town organized a small gathering at the same high school gymnasium where the original search parties had once assembled, folding chairs set out across the same worn wood floor where volunteers had once organized themselves into search grids decades earlier. Not a celebration exactly. Nobody quite knew what to call a reunion built out of 3 decades of grief, but a kind of communal exhale that let an entire community finally set down a weight it had carried, in one form or another, since the summer of 1991. Bev Callahan, Renee's mother, 92 years old by then and using a wheelchair, was brought to that gathering by her surviving family, and reporters who attended described her reaching out to touch Grace's face with both hands for nearly a full minute before either of them said a single word. The great-grandmother meeting. For the first time, the granddaughter she had spent 32 years believing she would never live long enough to see. Marcus Iyer, still early in a career that had begun, in a strange way, The moment he first heard the Callahan case as a child growing up in Millbrook Falls, told a local reporter that the hardest lesson of his first year as lead detective on a cold case had been learning that the truth, when it finally arrived after decades of silence, rarely divided the world cleanly into villains and victims the way it did in the stories people told each other to make sense of an unbearable loss. He kept, framed on his desk, a copy of the original nursery sign-out sheet, that single unidentified initial, an L scrawled in careful, deliberate handwriting that had taken investigators 32 years to finally trace back to a name. A reminder, he said, that even the smallest, most easily dismissed detail in a case file can turn out to be the one thread that unravels everything, given enough time and enough people stubborn enough to keep pulling on it. He continued working alongside federal investigators to identify every family potentially touched by Harold Voss's shadow network over the years, a slow, painstaking process he expected to occupy much of the remainder of his career, telling colleagues that Grace's case had taught him to treat even the coldest, most impossible file with the assumption that somewhere, someone was still quietly waiting for an answer they'd stopped believing would ever come. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits, folded quietly inside an old filing cabinet, for someone willing to keep looking. It waited, in this case, through 32 summers and 32 winters, through a detective's retirement and a mother's second marriage and a whole childhood lived 400 miles away under a stolen name. Patient in a way that no living person involved in the story had ever managed to be, until a woman sorting through her own mother's belongings on an ordinary rainy Saturday happened to notice a single water-stained document that didn't quite add up. Thank you for watching. If this case fascinated you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible crime and mystery stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop asking questions.